Hi, my name is Tina Nicol. I am a partner at the recruiting firm Major Lindsey in Africa. I am based in Chicago and I cover the general Midwest and market along with Colorado. Corporate law is really an overarching title used to describe a wide variety of areas that address business needs and the life cycle of a corporation. It's a transaction based practice, so unlike litigation, it does not involve going to court. There are many subspecialties that fall under the category of corporate law, and the practice of corporate law could look very different depending on your geographic location and whether you're at a firm or in house at a corporation. I will go into all of that in more detail shortly as we break down what it means to practice corporate law. A good place to start, though, is if you're wondering, is corporate law for you? You may want to ask what types of people typically are drawn to corporate law. It's typically people who are attracted to business and money, versus, for example, somebody who's more drawn to people stories and they may go into family law or labor and employment, or someone who's drawn to ideas who may go into intellectual property. In corporate law, people often like the ideas of working together as a team to come to a solution, which is different than litigation, where there's more adversaries and a winner and a loser. Also, people in corporate law are generally okay with having a somewhat unpredictable schedule. It can vary depending on what subspecialty you're in, but there can be a lot of surprises in this area of law. As I mentioned, there's a lot of subspecialties within corporate law. If you are practicing in a big city, especially like New York, a lot of times these practices have their own categories within a firm, their own divisions, but sometimes they're housed under one general corporate umbrella. It just depends on your geographic location and the firm. Big cities tend to have it broken down more. Smaller cities, it's more of a general practice. Similar, at a small firm, the practice can look a little bit more general. In New York, for example, corporate law tends to involve more finance work, whereas Silicon Valley or the West Coast tends to focus on venture, securities, IPO, startup, and high-tech counseling. New York attorneys tend to specialize more, and West Coast attorneys find more private company work. In the middle, in the Midwest, and in other smaller markets, you see a blend of both, where larger firms have more specialization, smaller firms may not. So, what are all these subspecialties that fall under the umbrella of corporate law? One example is mergers and acquisitions. In this practice, lawyers help companies acquire, be acquired, or merge with other companies. This practice can allow an attorney to work on big deals that make headlines and shape the client's business. Day to day work involves a lot of drafting, revising documents, negotiation, due diligence, and overseeing compliance with applicable laws. All parties work together to get the deal done. Schedules can be very unpredictable in this area, which some people love, but others try to avoid. Private equity. This is sort of a subset of the M&A practice. It's attorneys who work with banks, companies, and funds who want to invest in companies or perform leverage buyouts or management buyouts to obtain control of a company. It's centered in New York, but it's very prevalent in other big cities as well and continues to grow. These deals break into two parts, the M&A transaction and the finance part of the transaction. The M&A part is similar to public M&A, except there are continuing covenant and warranties between the parties. The debt finance piece involves getting a loan against the assets of the acquired entity, and it's typically done by finance attorneys. People who don't like this practice are typically frustrated by its narrowness. And like a general M&A practice, it can have quick deadlines and intense periods of work. Another area of corporate law is finance. And even within finance, there are various specialties. I'll give you a brief overview now. One type of finance is asset finance. This is where lawyers help companies purchase equipment, such as aircraft or trucks. Parties on one side are often the banks, and then companies on the other side. Another type of finance is banking. Here, where attorneys are representing banks or companies with respect to lender agreements. For example, lines of credit, loans, restructuring. There's a wide range of size of transactions. And this is in smaller firms, this is likely part of a general finance group, where in bigger firms, this can have its own group entirely. Within the banking practice, deadlines can be tight and schedules can fluctuate quite a bit. Project finance is where attorneys have the goal of financing the construction of large projects such as power plants, dams. It can involve a significant international piece. The day-to-day work can involve document drafting and negotiation. In general, it's a very document-heavy practice. And finally, there's structured finance. Structured finance is another area. The basic concept here is the securitization of loans to manage the risk of default. The attorney documents the parceling up of the loans and ensures compliance with SEC rules and state laws. Daily work involves drafting of offering memoranda, interacting with rating organizations, representing buyers and sellers, maybe even with negotiations of loans that are securitized. The principals in these transactions, banks and experienced investors, are sophisticated entities. This practice is concentrated mostly in large cities, especially in New York. Moving away from finance, but into another area of corporate law, is capital markets. This practice facilitates movement of money from one place to another within the market. It overlaps with securities practice, and it combines deal work with a regulatory piece. Another area is cross-border. There's a wide variety of deals that come up in this practice area, but they always involve transactions with foreign entities. It usually involves working with local counsel who is more familiar with the relevant laws. And again, much of this work is found in New York, but also within other large cities. One area of corporate law, which has been very busy in recent years, is fund formation. A fund is a collective investment scheme used for making investments in various equity or debt transactions. The practice can involve public or private deals. As some examples, private equity funds invest in the securities of companies that are not publicly traded or owned. Venture capital funds invest in startup companies that are thought to represent good growth potential. Clients are fund sponsors and investors, including private equity funds, hedge funds, fund of funds, real estate funds, distress funds, and secondary funds. Attorneys who work in this area will end up using a combination of knowledge, such as corporate law, tax, securities, and ERISA laws, to evaluate, structure, and negotiate transactions. The day-to-day work involves preparing offering materials, negotiation with prospective investors, preparing partnership and LLC agreements, advising on and documenting management and compensation arrangements, and closing fund formation transactions. Another area of corporate law involves the 40 Act. This practice combines corporate tax and ERISA practices. It deals with registered and unregistered funds. It's mostly found in large markets. The registered work involves SEC filings. Unregistered work is slightly more complex and involves tax issues, ERISA, and allows for more flexibility in structuring the relationship. Another practice that deals with more regulation is securities law. There, they focus on 33 and 34 Act matters. The daily practice involves due diligence, drafting documents, interfacing with the SEC, negotiating the offerings and or financing documents, writing memos. This practice is really good for people who like to be experts, they like gamesmanship, and they enjoy a rule-driven practice. People who don't like this practice often cite the repetition, especially with public company reporting, and the fact that it's very deadline-driven. With all these different types of law, a good question to ask is, where can you practice? As I mentioned, if you're in a big city, especially in New York, it's highly likely that you'll be focused in one of the subspecialties that I just discussed. There aren't many blended practice unless you go to a smaller firm. But in other areas of the country, that's not as true, and your practice can be more generalized, and you may end up touching on a lot of the different subspecialties I discussed. Another area where we see corporate law is in house legal departments. Typically, attorneys with a corporate law background can find a lot of opportunities within corporations as they have a lot of business needs and they can help the business run and grow. If you go down the path of being a corporate lawyer, what does the future look like for you? These are things to think about. Certainly, there are plenty of options within law firms for you to continue to grow and practice, and at all different sizes of law firms. It's also, as I mentioned, a very strong path to in house work if that's your end goal. Corporate lawyers, more so than any other type of lawyers, have the most in house opportunities available to them. And finally, for some people who ultimately decide that practicing law might not be for them after they perhaps move in house, there are lawyers who end up making the switch to the business side. While this isn't common, when we have seen it happen, it's most oftentimes somebody with a corporate law background. If you are interested in corporate law, I would recommend talking to your career services office or finding alumni who are currently practicing in this area. They can give you some great insight into what the day to day looks like and what different options may look like for you.